Good? Record? Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Gene Jones. I'm with an organization called the Southern Waste Information Exchange. Real quickly, my 30-second elevator pitch. We assist industry with waste issues. We've kind of act as a clearinghouse, matchmaker for waste. We put waste generators in touch with waste users to encourage recycling and reuse of waste materials. As part of our activity, we put on events and help coordinate events in the environmental sector. This being one of them, we do the Florida Remediation Conference now, as well as the Southeast Recycling Conference, and also the Waste Conversion Technology Conference. If you allow me, I'm going to make a couple of opening comments real quickly. First off, if everybody can put their phones on vibrate for me. Another clicker, David? It's not working. If y'all were here yesterday, I made the comment that after doing so many of these shows with regard to hybrid, so in-person, virtual, we're recording everything via Zoom right now. Inevitably, something is going to happen, and I can't promise you it won't, but I can promise you we will try to do everything we can to resolve the problem. So if you want to, David, just go ahead and advance the slide for me. Bear with us 1 minute. Welcome all the virtual attendees. Again, we're recording all the sessions and we'll make those available to everybody post-event. All right, now we're online. Just real quickly, attendance. Let me go back. Attendance right now, as of Friday, it was 226 people. 206 are in person and 9% virtually. A little bit different than last year, if you'll recall. It was almost completely opposite. Cell phones are off, restrooms down the corridor. There's also a business center. Conference support, if anybody runs into any problems or need assistance, you can come to us at our conference registration desk. Again, the proceedings will be sent out to everybody. I'm going to compile all the presentations, shoot them to PDF, make that available with the list of attendees, as well as the video recordings that I'll put up on a YouTube channel. Attendee opt-out option. If you do not want your name and contact information released, please let me know and we'll extract it out of the final database. Networking opportunities. We have all the functions in the food and beverage are going to be in the exhibit hall and throughout the corridor here, so I encourage you to network with the sponsors and their exhibiting booths. And then lastly, abstracts and bios. I've asked all the moderators not to read bios. If you all recall, I sent out a speaker moderator compendium that has all the bios in it and all the abstracts for all the presentations that you will see. Real quickly, if anybody needs continuing education credits, we do offer a certificate of attendance. We have to maintain the attendance records for 3 years, so we do charge a nominal fee of $25. If you need that, you can scan those QR codes to download the certificate or the payment link. We also have that out on the registration desk. Real quickly, if it weren't for the sponsors, this wouldn't happen, especially in these days right now. We've got to have sponsor support, so I have great appreciation for our title sponsor, Montrose Environmental. Our gold sponsors, Advanced Mobile Filtration, BETS, EC2, EVOAC, Geosyntec Consultants, Goldstein, Environmental Law, Ragnar Benson Construction, Regenesis, and Terracon. Our silver sponsors, Action Environmental, Apton, Blitzen Sundberg, BioLargo, Biotage, Blaine Tech Services, CDM Smith, Clark Environmental, GWTT, which is groundwater, ENRX, Halls Environmental, Langen, Mechanic, Nuco, Hearn, and Webster, HRP, PRM Filtration, Veritas, WSP, Petroleum, I should have printed that out, Petroleum Restoration and Recovery, and then SGS. Supporting organizations, Florida Brownfields Association, Florida Specifier, Mothers for Mother Earth, and then the conference itself is being organized by Environmental Industries and Conference Management, INSTEP, SWIX, Florida State University, and Environmental University. And then last, real quick, just a pitch out for the Florida Remediation Conference, which is coming up in November in Orlando. We're back at Champions Gate this year. So we're going to move right into the opening session. The session is going to be moderated by Maier, who is the PFAS program leader for Montrose Environmental. The way the program works is I've asked most of the presentations are slotted out in 30-minute sections. I've asked the speakers to plan on at least a 20-minute talk, something like that, and then leave 10 for Q&A. I've got a 5-minute card, so I'll be the bad guy right off the bat and give the authority to Martha to cut you all off or let you all know when you're getting close. So with that, I hope everybody enjoys the forum and looking forward to the networking that takes place. So with it, Martha, all yours.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the opening session of the PFAS Forum. I'm Martha Maier. I'm with Montrose Environmental Group, the PFAS program leader, and I've been involved in PFAS, been running my life for the last 10 years. So thank you all for coming, and I also want to thank the organizers for putting together such an informative program. We're going to start today with PFAS regulatory and a legislative update. So just a little bit of background here. Dealing with PFAS may be the most challenging chemical contaminant issue we've ever had to deal with. And there are a lot of reasons for this. First of all, the sheer number of compounds. We've got PFOA and PFAS, but there are, numbers are over 10,000 chemicals that could be part of this chemical family. That's a lot to deal with. And then you have to keep in mind that right now, we can only positively identify and measure fewer than 100 of those compounds. So we're starting at a disadvantage. Another thing, of course, they're ubiquitous. They're such useful chemicals that they've completely permeated our world. They're in our clothing, our makeup, our shampoo, they can be, our carpet, not to mention food packaging materials, and for quite a few people in their drinking water. So the list goes on of where we find them. And then the areas of significant releases, such as AFFF at airports, landfill leachates and gases, biospreading on agricultural lands, as well as manufacturing, certain types of manufacturing, the discharges and incineration. These are very different types of emissions that we need to evaluate and capture and treat. And then finally, we have data associated with several PFAS that associates them with serious side effects. But the vast majority of compounds we know very little about, and we may never know a lot about them. But in the meantime, we've got to make some really big decisions on how to deal with these compounds. So it is no surprise that with such a complex environmental problem, that the regulatory issues are also very challenging and complex. As you know, the states really took the lead on this early, and we've got different limits and levels around the United States right now. And now we have EPA, we know, is very committed to following the outline in the PFAS strategic plan. And we know that that's going to bring us some very impactful legislation that's right around the corner. So while this is all going on, there are over 250 state bills right now around the country addressing PFAS. And these cover everything from variations in drinking water limits, maybe under 5 parts per trillion to over 70, limits in different commercial products, and prohibitions in other products. So there is a lot going on right now in the area of PFAS legislation. So luckily, we're going to get a really good snapshot this morning of where we are right now, and we have very good coverage. We're going to talk about the legislative, what's upcoming here in Florida, throughout the United States, and then also what is expected at the federal level. So by the end of the session, we'll have a really sharp and clear snapshot of what the regulatory landscape is right now. So first of all, I'm very happy to introduce Taryn McKnight, a fellow Sacramentan, who is the PFAS practice leader for Eurofins Environmental Testing Group, and she will talk about the PFAS regulatory state of the union. Welcome, Taryn.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to move a little fast, so I hope everybody got their coffee. There's a lot to cover, and I just want to make sure that I share with you enough of a broad picture of what's happening. There's links to a lot of information on these slides, so you can, kind of follow up and dig in for deeper depth of information. So we're going to cover a lot of the federal actions because there's so much recent activity at the federal level, and we'll talk a little bit about what's been going on at the state levels, how that compares to federal actions, and then if I have time left, we'll touch on a little bit of the research and scientific developments that are going on as of late. So we'll start with the big ticket items. The PFAS strategic roadmap is the most current version of the EPA's plan to address PFAS. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. I'm not going to regurgitate it here for you. It's a very easy read. I just want to highlight for you that these 6 program areas you see listed here are addressed in the plan, and they all have a list of initiatives with estimated timelines on when they're going to accomplish those. So you've got kind of the heavy hitters on the top there, Office of Land and Emergency Management, Office of Water and Pollution Prevention. So those where a lot of the activity is taking place right now. Those initiatives are already in progress. And then I would say maybe in the next year or so, you want to keep an eye out on some of the activities out of those offices down listed at the bottom, Office of Air and ORD. So the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, has become a preferred tool to try and pass PFAS legislation. And it's become this kind of cyclical process. Every year the House tries to pass the PFAS Action Act, every year the Senate excludes it, but there are a few things that make it through, and it's usually AFFF related, which makes sense because the primary concern for the federal government is the DoD liabilities with their use of AFFF. This year's National Defense Authorization Act for year 2022, probably the most notable thing that was included was a temporary moratorium on the incineration of PFAS materials. So they attempted to address this in previous National Defense Authorization Acts, but this time they had to put a kind of hard line on a moratorium for it. So until the EPA or the DoD publish formal guidance or promulgated rule on treatment technologies on how to address the incineration, then none of that can proceed for now. And then there's a few other things, a task force to try and look for fluorine-free alternatives to AFFF foams that contain PFAS, and auditing their procurement processes to try and eliminate procuring materials that have PFAS in them. And then lastly, they have to complete a remediation schedule with cost estimates for what it's going to take to clean up PFAS at all of the sites that have had a PFAS release, military sites. Okay, so as outlined in the strategic roadmap, on January 10th, the EPA notified OMB, that the Office of Management and Budget, that they intend to propose a rule to designate PFOA and PFOS. By the way, you'll hear me probably interchangeably call those PFO and PFAS, as hazardous substances under CERCLA. And OMB has about a 90-day average review period for that. That period has passed. So now EPA can propose that rule for public comment. It was part of their agenda to propose that rule in the spring of this year with hopes of finalizing the rule by the summer of next year. And of course, that has some pretty far-reaching implications on cleanup, cost recovery, reopening closed sites. It would be addressed formally as under an ASTM Phase 1 all appropriate inquiries rule. So that one looks pretty imminent. And then, in response to a petition from the governor of New Mexico, along with a few other organizations, the EPA has agreed to evaluate considering listing these 4 compounds as RCRA hazardous constituents. So they've stated that if existing data for these 4 constituents supports listing any of them, they'll proceed with proposing said rule. And then the implications for that would be that these would be covered under hazardous waste storage, treatment, and disposal facilities. And an interesting thing about this, if they get listed as RCRA hazardous constituents, they will then automatically be listed as circular hazardous substances and as hazardous air pollutants. So we'll have to see which one of those happens first. Now, EPA is committed to continuing to conduct toxicity assessments, and they're kind of, at this stage, just doing it individual compounds at a time. So we finally got a final toxicity report for PFBS at the end, early last year, and then GenX at the end of last year. Right now, PFBA and PHXA are in progress, and then there's a few more that are in the queue. So it's pretty slow going on the toxicity assessments for a very large class of chemicals. And then an interesting thing about the GenX toxicity assessment that was published last year is the RFD, the reference dose, ended up being quite a bit lower than the reference dose for PFOA and PFAS, which was a bit unexpected for the industry because they thought GenX was less toxic than PFOA. But on that note, EPA is revisiting the RFD for PFOA and PFAS. So at the end of last year, they submitted updated health assessments to the Scientific Advisory Board, or SAB, for review, proposing much lower RFDs, orders of magnitude lower than they had previously used. That those are the RFDs that basically result in that screening value of 70 parts per trillion. So if they use the same calculations or methodologies to convert these RFDs to screening values or health advisory values, we'd be looking at orders of magnitude lower than the current 70 part per trillion. So just this last month, the SAB finalized their review and submitted a report back to the EPA, and they agreed with some of their conclusions, but they took note that there are some inconsistencies in the methodologies that were applied, some flawed data, lack of transparency. So we'll have to see what EPA does with SAB's report. But so this information is really critical because this is going to inform what the primary drinking water standard is going to be for PFOA and PFOS. This is how they're going to arrive at what MCLs to propose sometime this year. They originally wanted to propose it this spring. I don't know about you guys in Florida and California, spring is well behind us. So we'll have to see when they get that draft rule out, but they were hoping to get that finalized pretty soon. And then, so the EPA does not have established wastewater limits for industrial discharges to public treatment plants or to surface waters, but in September of last year, they did publish the preliminary effluent guideline plan 15 and indicated that they intend to establish limits. So they're going to be doing it kind of sector by sector. And so the first few sectors that they're addressing are going to be chemical, plastics, and synthetic fiber by the summer of 2023, and then following that up with limits for the electrochemical plating sector by summer of 2024. So this is another action that resulted from the NDAA. EPA was directed to propose a rule requiring reporting on PFAS manufacturing. So anybody who manufactured or imported PFAS chemicals into the U.S. since January of 2011 would have to report on the uses, the production volumes, exposures, health effects. And so the EPA has indicated that if this goes through, that they would gain data on an additional 1,000 PFAS compounds. Another result of the NDAA was adding PFAS to the TRI. So the Toxics Release Inventory is a provision that requires manufacturers across sectors in the U.S. to report annually on releases to the air, water, or land, including land disposal, for the TRI chemicals. So 174 PFAS were added in the first year, 2020, and those data were reported in July of 2021. And let's just say the EPA didn't get all the data they were expecting to get. So they had done some background before this on how many industries utilize PFAS, how many chemicals, and the reporting fell far short of what they expected. So if you look at the bottom here, there's this de minimis exemption for TRI, where if a listed chemical is part of a mixture at less than 1%, it's not reportable. Well, it turns out a lot of PFAS is used in mixtures at less than 1%. So there are some advocacy groups that have filed lawsuits to remove these TRI exemptions. EPA has already acknowledged that it's their intention to remove them so that they can improve the quality of the data that they're getting from TRI reporting in future years. And then anything that gets a toxicity assessment completed and is added to IRIS automatically gets added to TRI. So PFBS, for example, when they published that report last year, it automatically triggered adding it to TRI. So we're going to continue to see this list of TRI chemicals tick up. Okay, so then I'm just going to highlight actions around drinking water because it's such a big topic. For those of you who are not familiar with the process for setting a drinking water standard, this is what it looks like. So last year, the EPA announced that they were going to move forward with the rulemaking process. This year, they're trying to figure out what that proposed rule is going to look like. So as I mentioned, the SAB report, trying to figure out what MCLs should be, and then they're going to propose that rule maybe by this summer, and then however long it takes to finalize that rule after public comment. And so the part of that rulemaking process begins with something called the UCMR. It's the Unregulated Contaminants Monitoring Rule. So it's where EPA says, okay, we think that there's maybe a concern about these chemicals. We're going to go look for them across public water systems in the US and see how prevalent they are and whether setting a drinking water standard is warranted. So with UCMR 3, they looked at 6 PFAS compounds, and that's what started the whole process for where we're at today for setting a standard for PFOA and PFAS. They're getting ready to start this process all over again with UCMR 5. So this is the first time in UCMR history that we're going to be looking for the same chemicals twice. So they're going to look for the same 6 chemicals they did last time, but also additional chemicals. So now it's up to a list of 29. The reason why 29 is that's all they have drinking water methods developed for. And then previously, they looked at only public water systems that served more than 10,000 customers. Now it's going to include anything over 3,300 customers, with about 800 public water systems serving even less than 3,000 customers. So that whole monitoring and reporting process under UCMR is going to take place between now and 2026. So it's going to be a while before we have the results of this, and then the EPA has to evaluate whether those data suggest that new drinking water standards are warranted for additional PFAS compounds. And this is what that list of analytes look like. So there's, like I said, the 6 from UCMR 3, there's some additional short chain PFAS, some replacement compounds, things that EPA has zeroed in on as what they think are relevant at this moment. Okay, so now let's look in contrast at state action. So while feds have been trying to figure all of this out, the states have been taking their own actions, and mostly in terms of doing surveys and setting limits. So from a drinking water limit standpoint, you can see it's pretty sparse. Most of the activity is in the Northeast, a little bit in the Midwest, but not too many states have actually moved forward with setting their own drinking water limits. But what you will notice is the range. So you have EPA's screening level of 70 parts per trillion, but then the states are all much lower than that. Although you see a number of states listed at 20, that's the sum of multiple compounds cannot exceed 20. So in reality, most states are in the kind of 5 to 10 part per trillion range is the sweet spot right now, which is getting very close to laboratory reporting limits, just FYI. And then another effort at the state level has been to conduct these surveys. So just surveying their drinking water supplies. Do we have a problem? How extensive is it? And a number of states have done this. I've just highlighted a few here for you, where they really haven't found much at all. Maybe a couple of exceedances, and those exceedances were maybe in the 20 to 70 part per trillion range. Maybe a few over 70 part per trillion. Some had no exceedances over 70 part per trillion. So no real, glaring red flags in the drinking water public supply surveys for the compounds that they're looking for. So we always want to keep that in mind. They're looking for a very limited list of compounds. So as we start to expand those lists, that picture may change. As we start to compare that list to lower and lower limits, that picture may change. And then states have also worked on setting cleanup criteria for groundwater. You can kind of see a similar trend here with going lower than that 70 part per trillion limit. Some of them are ratified, a lot of them are not. There's just proposed or guidance limits. And as I mentioned, several states tend to sum up the total of 5-6 compounds cannot exceed whatever those limits are. And then probably a more emerging topic is surface water and tissue limits. So most states that have decided to set limits first tackle drinking water, then groundwater, and then with the states that have concerns about fish consumption, they've set fish tissue limits, and then usually the surface water limits are set to be protective of the fish tissue limits. And those limits tend to be really low, like well below what the laboratory's reporting limits are at. So a lot of work to be done there on being able to achieve kind of this emerging trend of lower and lower screening values. And then lastly is ambient air. Not many states have attempted to tackle this, but there are a few. New Hampshire was the lone wolf for a long time, many years, and then Texas joined them, and then most recently, in the last 2 years, Michigan, New York, and Minnesota have set limits, and primarily just for PFOA and PFAS, although Michigan does also have a limit for 6.2 FTS. And these are pretty low limits, and when you start to think about the interplay of atmospheric deposition and then these really low surface water limits, they all kind of have to be in sync with each other. How am I doing on time, Martha? Close? Okay, I'll speed through this, just holler at me. All right, so research and scientific developments, I mean, this would be an all-day talk, so I'm just gonna pick out a few to highlight for you. In order to support all these regulatory efforts, you have to have methods for testing. So EPA is focused on method development. They've recently released 2 draft methods. First is the EPA Draft 1633. This is a targeted analysis to analyze for 40 PFAS compounds in non-potable water, soil, and tissues. And then that method is in the process of a multi-lab validation right now, so still a lot subject to change with it. Once they finish that process, get all the feedback, rework whatever needs adjusting on the method, then they'll publish a final draft for public comment, and then eventually a final method. So we're still a ways out from that, but that's in process. And then most recently, they just released a draft 1621. Now this is at the opposite end of the spectrum. This is a organic fluorine method, so it provides a total mass number, not speciated results for individual compounds. And it's used as a proxy tool for total PFAS, since we can't analyze for all the individual PFAS compounds that might be present. And so the compound list is a really important part of what we regulate, and how we can comply with those regulations, what we can even test for. So the compounds you see listed on the left in orange are the compounds that are part of that draft 1633 method. And then on the right in white, you see additional compounds that are commercially available but not yet part of an EPA method. But still, we're only at about 80 compounds there. So we're still hundreds and thousands off from the whole class of PFAS compounds, which is why we're pulling in tools like the total organic fluorine to try and bridge that gap until such time we can get more standards and more data for the individual compounds. The CDC is an important part of the research that's going on. So they are doing exposure studies. First, they started with exposure to drinking water at AFFF impacted sites, so military sites around the country. Then they moved on to measuring impacts indoors, residential indoor environments from things like indoor air and dust. And then they do biomonitoring of the U.S. general population to measure how much PFAS and which PFAS are in our blood. And then the EPA is conducting research on things like additional pathways of concern, like do PFAS pose a vapor intrusion pathway concern? Do they have the necessary volatility? If so, which ones and at what levels? They're also looking at source air emissions and those products of incomplete combustion. So when we're looking at destructive technologies, we need to know, are we really destroying all the PFAS that are present, or are we creating byproducts or transformation products? And so they're doing a lot of research on that front. I think a place where there's a little bit of disconnect between the federal and state priorities is on biosolids. So EPA and their roadmap have indicated that they're looking at doing an assessment of PFOA and PFAS and biosolids to determine whether regulations are even needed, and that's slated for the winter of 2024. But you've got states grappling with biosolid issues now and have been for several years. And so I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there on the research that's needed to support the states. And then on the food supply side of things, you've got the FDA conducts a thing called the Total Diet Study, and they've done this for the last 3 years to address PFAS. So they just look at foods that are part of a normal U.S. diet and look to see if PFAS are present. And they found virtually nothing in each of their Total Diet studies. But then you have that against the backdrop of all of these news reports. I included some of the article snippets for you of you've got 17 states with legislation to ban PFAS in food contact material, in consumer products. You've got reports of contaminated dairy farms, milk supplies, cattle, beef. And so there seems to be a disconnect there as well about whether PFAS in the food supply really is a concern or not. So a lot more research, I think, is needed on that front. And with that, we are at the end. Thanks, everyone. Do we have time for
Questions, yeah.
Okay.
We have a lot of overlap, and we're touching on some different things some of the similar things in the talks today. So we're just going to hold off on questions till the very end. So now I'd like to introduce Aaryn Jones. She is the Emerging Contaminants Coordinator with the US EPA Region 4. She's going to talk about PFAS Strategic Roadmap, EPA's commitment to action.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Martha, for the intro, and thank you, Taryn, for covering so many of the federal actions. So I will do my best to kind of not repeat, but emphasize where emphasis is needed and maybe give you a little more insight into the federal actions that are underway. We'll start with what we're going to cover in this briefing, which will not cover the background on PFAS. I'm assuming a baseline of knowledge, and Martha did a great job of quickly going over the scope, so we know there's a big issue and lots of challenges ahead of us. EPA's approach and goals behind developing the roadmap, so just kind of give you a little insight on how the roadmap was developed, the perspectives that were considered, and then also we'll dive right into the roadmap actions, which are organized by EPA Program Office at headquarters. And we'll finish today with a quick look at the bipartisan infrastructure law and the funding that will be available for PFAS, especially in water infrastructure through that. So we'll dive right in to the development of the strategic roadmap. So Administrator Michael Regan, soon after he was confirmed, almost over a year ago, quickly established the EPA Council on PFAS. So this is a senior group of agency policymakers across all media, and it's co-chaired, the council is co-chaired by our Office of Water Assistant Administrator, Radhika Fox, and also by the Region 1 Deputy Regional Administrator, Deb Zaro. So as a regional person down here in Region 4, I really appreciate that regional voice being on the council, because as headquarters works to develop policy, I feel like it's really important to have that implementation voice at the table, and the regions are much closer to that. So, this council worked really hard to put together the roadmap, which was released in October of last year, and it lays out EPA's whole-of-agency approach to tackling PFAS. It sets timelines for concrete actions from 21 to 2024, and there's, as Taryn mentioned, there are concrete timelines for each action, so we're looking to hold our own selves accountable for meeting those goals. This roadmap also puts a basic floor of federal protection, so that there's a gap there right now. As everybody's clearly noted, the states have been out ahead of the federal government and have landed in different places, so we're looking to kind of get a baseline of federal protection here in place. The roadmap also supports the state's ongoing efforts. We're doing a lot of investment in research that will hopefully help support all the state's efforts. And it builds on the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to scientific integrity. So all the work that we do, we're looking to base in science. I'm going to skip that one. And then, again, not getting into this kind of life cycle diagram, but we know PFAS are everywhere, they're in all media, and so that presents really unique challenges. As we look to develop the roadmap, we wanted to consider the life cycle, cradle to grave, all the various exposure pathways, get upstream of the problem, so prevention is key. We want to see how we can stop these contaminants from getting in the environment in the first place. We're looking to hold polluters accountable, and so we will be looking at polluters and responsible parties for their actions, and also to remediate PFAS where they've been released. Fourth, again, ensuring that science-based decision-making. And fifth, prioritizing the protection of disadvantaged communities to make sure they have equitable access to solutions. So yesterday, I'm not sure how many of y'all were able to participate in the EJ workshop that was part of this conference, but Brian Holtzclaw from Region 4 was on that panel, and he's our EJ and Children Health Section Chief, so he walks through some of EPA's environmental justice efforts and some high-level PFAS concerns, but we're definitely looking to engage with communities as we continue to work through the roadmap. So, as Taryn mentioned, we've got these three broad goals in the strategic roadmap, and I have heard this misrepresented as a stepwise process, that we would first research, then restrict, then remediate, but I want to make it clear we're doing all these things at once in the roadmap. So science-based decision-making, where we have the science, we're going forward with looking for ways to restrict, and we're looking to accelerate the remediation and cleanup of PFAS where we can. Make sure I didn't miss anything there. So I've got little notes that I add in for depending on the audience, so I'll make sure I don't miss anything that's happened recently and or that y'all might be interested in specifically here at this Waste Focus Conference. So I think that was it for the basics of the roadmap. We're going to dive right into the actions that are organized by our offices at headquarters. So for the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, so you'll hear me say OCSPP, that's where the TSCA program is housed and where the Toxics Release Inventory Program is, or TRI. So first of all, we're looking to deepen our understanding of PFAS categories through the National PFAS Testing Strategy, which we released last fall in conjunction with the roadmap itself. So this is the goal of the testing strategy, is to break PFAS into distinct categories, to direct research, to amplify regulatory action, and to accelerate the technology and policy solutions so that we can restrict and remediate PFAS more effectively. This testing strategy will help us understand and address the impacts of these categories. So I'm going to walk you through really quick at a high level. It's kind of a dense read, the testing strategy. So they started off with the OCSPP definition of PFAS, which gets you to about 6,500 different PFAS individual. So that was where they started. And then they looked at those 6,500 and they put them in 70 categories that were statistically similar in structure. And then they further reduced that to 56 categories that we didn't have any toxicity data on whatsoever. And then they further reduced that to 24 of those categories that we could actually identify a manufacturer who was making something in that category that we could send a test order to. So that is the very, very first phase of the testing strategy, is those 24 chemicals and that first set of orders that will go out based on that prioritization scheme I just ran through. But you can read much more about all the statistics, and it's a dense read, but that's the high-level approach for now. So EPA is also working under TSCA authorities to strengthen our oversight for new and existing PFAS. So we're looking to ensure a robust review process for new PFAS and ensuring that chemicals are safe before they enter commerce. We're also looking to kind of go back and review existing PFAS under TSCA to ensure that they're not being used in new ways that are concerning, and also to make sure that legacy PFAS production has not resumed in any way. One quick example of this is on March 16th, EPA announced a notification to industry, and that was manufacturers, importers, processors, distributors, users, and those that dispose of fluorinated HDPE containers, that the presence of PFAS as a byproduct of things being stored in those containers may be a violation under TSCA. So that's just a quick example of how the TSCA program is looking closely at PFAS. So EPA is also collecting data and improving reporting on how PFAS are used and released. So under TSCA Section 8, which Taryn mentioned this one, to better understand the sources and quantities of manufactured PFAS, this was proposed last June, and as proposed, it would collect information on uses, production volumes, disposal, exposures, and hazards. So it's a broad swath of information we're looking to gather here. As of last April, there were 1,364 PFAS that might be covered under that effort, and that is existing chemicals that are manufactured, processed, or imported in the United States. 669 of those are actually identified as active in the U.S. commerce. And then under the toxics release inventory, we're looking to enhance that reporting. Again, Taryn mentioned that we've got 179 now for calendar year 22 that are included under TRI. We have added 4 in January. There's triggers in the bill to continue adding PFAS depending on increasing knowledge about them. And so one thing that we noted as we released the 2020 TRI data for the first time is that, and Taryn mentioned this too, we didn't get back what we thought we would. So we're going to be proposing a rule this summer that would remove the eligibility of that de minimis exemption that Taryn was talking about. And then finally, under our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, we're working to establish a PFAS voluntary stewardship program. So we expect this program to challenge industry to go above and beyond the regulatory or compliance requirements that exist now and to reduce overall releases of PFAS in the environment. So the next headquarters office we'll get to is Office of Water, and there's way more going on than this slide kind of indicates, but we'll fly through it, and Taryn covers some of it, so I'll be going quick. So we're taking an extensive set of actions under our water program, both the Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act. So under the Safe Drinking Water Act, EPA has taken a groundbreaking step later this year to set enforceable limits for PFOA and PFAS in drinking water. Again, we're planning to propose a rule that would set those limits, require monitoring of public water supplies, and evaluate additional PFAS and groups of PFAS for regulation. So we know the public's been calling for this for many years. We're taking action as quickly as possible and in advance of our statutory deadline to do so. So in support of our rulemaking, Taryn mentioned the Science Advisory Board. They're looking at some draft science documents, released their draft report on April 1st. There are 2 upcoming public meetings. Actually, one is this afternoon, and one is May 6th in the afternoon, where they're going to discuss that report. There's a public comment with today's meeting associated with it, so you can always go to the SAB website and see the minutes, because they record, they don't record the meetings, I don't think, but they record what's said, so you can kind of see what the public comment was, and that's happening later today. So this new science is going to form the foundation of our work, and as Taryn mentioned, the numbers are going lower. The draft science indicates that negative health effects may occur at much lower levels than previously understood, and that PFOA is a likely carcinogen, which would trigger another, if found to be the case, would trigger additional regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So under the, under the Clean Water Act, EPA is working to develop discharge limits for industries that use PFAS through the Effluent Limitation Guidelines program. So we're working to establish national technology-based regulatory limits on those 9 industrial categories that Taryn had mentioned. So specifically last September, we announced ELGs and pretreatment standards are warranted for that organic chemicals, plastics, and fibers category, as well as the metal finishing category, and that we're going to further study other categories such as landfill and textile mill categories, among others. And so we're going to accompany this work by leveraging our National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permitting program, to improve monitoring and reduce PFAS discharges to waterways. Just last week, EPA released 3 water updates in a press release. So one of them was that we had a guidance document or a memo released entitled Addressing PFAS Discharges in EPA-Issued NPDES Permits and Expectations Where EPA is the Pretreatment Control Authority. So this memo is providing instructions for monitoring provisions, analytical methods, use of pollution prevention, and best management practices to address PFAS discharges. And EPA plans to issue a future guidance to states, to state permitting authorities to further restrict PFAS discharges. So that is still in the works. Our national water program is also working to improve PFAS monitoring. Taryn mentioned the UCMR 5, so it's going to be, again, 29 PFAS and significantly more drinking water systems than before. So that will take place from years 2023 to 2025. And again, one thing I don't think Taryn mentioned was this is going to be at lower detection limits than the previous UCMR 3. So we're looking for a lot more PFAS. The PFAS that we did look for, we're going to get lower detection limit results back, and we're testing more systems this time. So those are the key things about UCMR 5. EPA is also working on health advisories for PFAS in drinking water. It's going to enable states, tribes, and local governments to inform the public and take appropriate action. We expect to issue the final health advisories this spring, and I'll clarify for everybody, I think this must have been written with a northern seasonal perspective, because spring for the roadmap tracking purposes is, I think it's April through June. So I know we've got through June when we say spring. So just wanted to clarify that. It's not Florida seasons we're talking about, or California. So we are looking to issue those for the first time ever for Gen X and PFBS, and update our existing health advisories for PFOA and PFAS based on that newer science that we were talking about with the Science Advisory Board. We're also looking to improve analytical methods. So Taryn mentioned draft method 1633, so that we can get to more environmental media and understand and quantitate PFAS. And then again, another announcement from last week was the draft method 1621, which was that screening AOF method, absorbable organic fluorine. So when used in conjunction with methods that target individual PFAS, that draft method will help further our understanding about the presence and forms of PFAS in wastewater. And then the final update from last week's water-related updates was that we released the Clean Water Act aquatic life criteria for PFOA and PFAS. That's intended to protect aquatic life from short and long-term toxic effects from PFOA and PFAS. And so once published in the Federal Register, which should happen this week if it hasn't already happened, there's going to be a 30-day public comment period. And eventually states and tribes may consider adopting the final criteria into their water quality standards. And then a couple more water items we'll head on is that we're looking to enhance data availability on PFAS and fish tissue, which we know that states and tribes are working towards developing. And then finally, we're evaluating the risk of PFAS and biosolids and recognizing that is a priority in many states. But we'll be finalizing a risk assessment for that will serve as the basis for determining whether or not a regulation is appropriate for PFOA and PFAS. The next office is, this one's 2 together. This is OLEM, our Office of Land and Emergency Management, so the cleanup side of things, and also the Office of Air and Radiation, so on the air. So we combine those 2 here. Under CERCLA, again, we're looking to develop that regulation to designate PFAS as CERCLA hazardous substances. We're well aware that is hung up in OMB, as everyone has mentioned, but that would be a big effort on the cleanup side for us to be able to gather information, hold polluters accountable, and recover costs for cleanup. And this designation would be the first time that any chemicals have been added directly to the CERCLA hazardous substance list in this way. We expect to propose the rule later this spring, but again, it is in OMB right now. And then we will finalize the rule in 2023 according to the current plan. So we're also exploring whether to take the same action for additional PFAS beyond just PFOA and PFAS. And then the RCRA actions have been gone through pretty well. I was trying to see if there's anything I wanted to add. But again, that's not a full listing under RCRA, but it's looking to potentially propose adding those 4 PFAS, the ones that we have the most toxicity data about, which is PFOA, PFAS, PFBS, and Gen X, as hazardous constituents under Appendix 8 of RCRA. So it gives us that corrective action authority, but not the full RCRA regulation, but it's a step towards that. And then we're also looking to initiate a separate rulemaking to clarify that the RCRA Corrective Action Program does have the authority to require investigation and cleanup for wastes that meet the statutory definition of a hazardous waste. So again, not that regulatory listing, but the statutory definition, which is more broad. And this modification would make it clear that PFAS can be cleaned up through RCRA. And EPA is also taking significant steps to update our research and guidance on PFAS destruction and disposal. So under the Office of OLEM, the Land and Emergency Management, we published an interim guidance back in December of 2020. It was a requirement of one of the NDAAs. So back in that document, we highlighted the significant uncertainties about the effectiveness of some PFAS destruction and disposal technologies. And our scientists, it's a top priority for EPA to improve our understanding of these technologies, and we plan to update that guidance to reflect both the public comments and the newly published research results. And just as a sidebar, we got over 5,000 comments on that guidance, which is pretty high for a guidance document. And the NDAA requires updating at least every 3 years. We're trying to build that body of research to update that as soon as possible. We're also taking steps to restrict PFAS by building the technical foundation under the Clean Air Act. We're looking there just, again, to build that for action. And so the air side of things is very early in the process. But we're looking to understand monitoring approaches, mitigation technologies, fate and transport, and those kind of things to see if it could support a future decision on whether or not to designate PFAS as a hazardous air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And one item I wanted to highlight to this audience that just happened on May 2nd, EPA withdrew the direct final rule that would have incorporated the new ASTM standard into the standards and practices for all appropriate inquiry. And that new version of the standard had an option to include PFAS for environmental assessments. It was pulled back, the direct final rule was pulled back because of adverse comment, so EPA is going to look to address those comments in a future final rulemaking that won't have a comment period. So that just popped out this week in the Federal Register. Okay. For our Office of Research and Development, this is our foundation of our work on PFAS. We're working to develop and validate the methods, many of which have been mentioned here, but targeted methods and non-targeted methods, and looking at total PFAS methods as well to help screen. Second, we're looking to advance the science, human health, and environmental risks from PFAS. So we've got those chemicals that are in various phases of the toxicity assessment development. PFBA, the draft was released last fall. PFHXA, the draft is out right now, and there are peer review meetings coming up on May 16th and 17th for that one. And as Taryn mentioned, PFHXS, PFNA, and PFDA are ongoing. And so we're looking to build that toxicity science base there. We're also looking under our ORD office to identify PFAS sources, transport and exposure pathways, and to understand how PFAS may contribute to cumulative impacts on communities. And finally, we're looking to develop technologies for reducing PFAS in the environment, drinking water and wastewater treatment, contaminated site cleanup, air emission controls, and end-of-life management. So if you Google EPA PFAS research, the first return will be the ORD webpage that's dedicated to their current efforts. At the bottom of the page, there is an EPA publications about PFAS research. We currently have about 977 publications and counting in our science inventory database. So the last time I talked, it was 967, so they've published 10 more papers in the last week, so things are just really changing quick. So keep up there if you're interested in learning more about the science on PFAS. It's gathered there for you. One other thing I wanted to highlight was the PFAS thermal treatment database was released in February. It's a little hard to find, so I'll look to see if I can get the web link out for y'all if you're interested, or come ask me about it. But it basically assembles treatability research for PFAS for thermal processes. So treatment in different media via thermal process. So if you're interested in that, just based on this audience, I wanted to make sure you knew that was out there and available. So getting close to the end, the cross-program actions, again, we are engaged truly across all the media programs because PFAS is one of those unique things that's kind of forcing us to do that, and it's good that we're all talking. And so we're looking to engage directly with affected communities. That's one of the things we're all looking at closely, and we will be doing that, acting on that engagement over the next year. We're also committed to using our enforcement tools across media to address PFAS releases. We'll use these where they're appropriate to require actions and to limit future releases and to address existing contamination. We're committed to reporting on EPA's progress and communicating PFAS risks, so there will be an annual public report that will summarize our progress, so we'll have one of those this fall, summarizing the first year of action. We'll also be educating the public about the risks of PFAS and working to develop those kind of risk communications materials. And finally, EPA is coordinating with our federal agency partners on policy strategies. So concurrently with the PFAS roadmap, the White House announced additional coordinated action to advance critical progress on securing clean air, safe food, and clean drinking water. Through these efforts, EPA and its partners are advancing priority efforts on research, analytical methods, contaminated site cleanup, and other areas. And in December, President Biden signed an executive order 14057 to reestablish the federal government as a leader in sustainability. And one element of this was acquisition and procurement, including the prioritization of purchase of products without added PFAS. So under that order, EPA is taking action to provide federal purchasers with tools to avoid procurement of products containing PFAS, and to identify products and purchase categories that are known to be associated with key PFAS issues. And so that's EPA's piece in that executive order. And we're also collaborating with agencies such as the ODE on analytical methods, Department of Health and Human Services on assessing PFAS human health risks, and Department of Ag on PFAS in the food system. So the final slide is the bipartisan infrastructure law on PFAS. So no conversation would be complete without highlighting that. It was signed by Biden back in November, and it's the single largest investment in clean water that the federal government has ever made. The bill will build on the research, restrictions, and remediation called for in the roadmap by providing $10 billion in relief for communities impacted by PFAS or other emerging contaminants. The bill builds on 3 of EPA's existing water finance programs, but focuses them specifically on PFAS and emerging contaminants. And it provides this $10 billion of funding without any state match requirements as grants or principal forgiveness loans. So that's truly great news for the states. They can use this without a match. Of the $10 billion, we've got $4 billion flowing through the drinking water revolving loan funds, $1 billion through the clean water state revolving funds, and $5 billion directly as grants to address emerging contaminants in small and disadvantaged communities. So EPA is committed to maximizing the impact of these funds, and we're thrilled that they can provide relief to communities, and as we continue to take action to research, restrict, and remediate PFAS under our roadmap. And I would encourage y'all to go take a look. That's all I got. I would encourage y'all to go take a look at the roadmap. It is organized well, and it has very clear timelines and more information on a lot of the things I said today. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaryn. That was a lot of really good information, and it followed really well on Taryn's foundation for all the regulations that we're going to talk about this morning. Next up, we have Jorge Caspary, principal with Cameron Cole, and he's going to talk about what transpired leading to the 2022 PFAS law in Florida and going forward. Thank you, Jorge.
Good morning, everybody. I don't have a presentation. Mine's more a narrative of what happened in the legislature this year and where is the state, at least from a responsible party legislative perspective, going to be in the next year or two. So again, I don't have a presentation. Mine's more of a narrative, but let me just start with, it's very nice to see some of the old guard here that began with that little chemical known perc and trichloroethylene, I can assure my friends in the old guard that we will retire on PFAS. And for those young persons in their 20s right outside of engineering or geology or science school, stick around. PFAS is your key to retirement. You know, this new recalcitrant's been here and it's going to be there for a while. So with that in mind, let me give you a little bit of a timeline. If you attend summer school, you know that I moderate a class called Hot Topics, and back in 2018 or 2019, this little PFAS issue began to emerge, and I forecasted winter is coming. And you know, you've seen today from the distinguished ladies here that there are regulations coming from the left, from the right, from top, from the bottom. We're being squeezed. And so what happened? DEP, and we need to applaud DEP in the state of Florida, back in 2018 or 2019 began to take a look at this thing and see what are we dealing with in terms of utilities and PFAS. And for those of you that work in Florida and have clients, we began to see the infamous or famous 62780 letters that in essence say to a city, a fire department, or a college, you are responsible to assess these things, these substances, and you're responsible for remediation under state law. And so cities, counties, fire departments began to react duly, as they should. That was the very beginning, 2018 or 2019, when we began to wrap our arms around this thing in Florida. And my firm also has some clients that are in this process. So there was some regulatory intervention, but we did not begin to realize the magnitude of this issue in Florida. It's huge. I mean, we're a big state. You know, we're bigger than a lot of states. We keep receiving a lot of people. We receive 1,000 new people per day, and you know, we drink groundwater for our potable water sources. So as a consultant, I began to realize what is really the magnitude of this, you know, because there are several facets to this. Liability is one of the main ones, and you'll hear today from attorneys, you know, are cities, counties, fire departments liable for third-party lawsuits, damage to human health, damage to the environment? They'll be talking about it today. Assessment issues, define who is the source and how far these things extend. In some cases, you know, PFAS can be found far away from the source. There are multiple sources. If you're assessing a fire department or a fire station and there's a dry cleaner adjacent or nearby, well, where is the source? You know, yeah, you can do forensics, but those things are expensive. And so, you know, there are many facets to this issue. Remediation. You know, the letters from DEP said, you need to remediate. You're liable for this remediation. And so, how do you remediate a substance that's hard to break down to the elemental compounds? I mean, carbon and fluorine are one of the hardest bonds in the environment. It's very hard to break. You can filtrate, you can pump and treat, you can do a lot of things, but the aquifer itself is out of commission for a long time. So how do we look at the aquifers that are going to be out of commission for a while? I mean, in essence, we began to realize, those of us that are involved in a little bit of policy making, this is a paradigm change, in Florida at least. You know, do we write off the aquifer while it's being remediated? We certainly cannot put more wells and start drinking PFAS contaminated groundwater. So we began to realize a few things. Finally, I'm here to give you a different perspective, and that, you know, who pays for this? Who is going to be paying for the assessment and remediation? As we all know, and we all work on PFAS, this assessing is not cheap, and remediating is certainly not cheap. And so some of my clients began to ask me questions. Who pays? You know, some of my clients are small cities with a very small tax base. And so they had to take budgets out for let's say, for a road building or a necessary expense in order to assess PFAS. So we begin to get to the point of balancing priorities for some clients. So we proposed, and I know that there are a few attorneys here that worked with me, back in 2020, and you know what happened in 2020, you know, the world came to a stop. We began to prepare a concept called, well, let's try to design some of these brownfield sites. And those of you that have worked in brownfields realize that there is some level of liability protection, but also there's a measure of getting money back in the form of tax credits, corporate tax credits, because clients were spending money and, you know, with while abandoned, trying to figure out what's going on. And we started to educate the legislature. As you know, our industry is more reactive than proactive. We react to what comes down in terms of rules and regulations, and we try to do the best job we can in terms of assessing and determining who's going to clean it up, how much it's going to cost, what's the present worth cost of cleaning some for the next 30 years. So we began to educate legislatures in Florida, you know, and meanwhile other states moved with, 10 parts per trillion groundwater cleanup target levels or standards. The feds began to take a look at, hey, this is serious. We knew that this was serious, but now it's really serious. And so we began to educate the legislatures in Florida. And as you would imagine, those people that represent us, they're not engineers, they're not scientists, most of them are attorneys, insurance agents. So it was a kind of difficult to explain in terms of what's PFAS and what are the consequences of this in Florida. It was a process. And in 2020, the legislature never met in person, they met remotely, so it was twice as difficult to try to figure out. We tried to put the brownfields plan. It never went anywhere because at that time the state was broke. And the only thing the legislator wanted to do was, we need to address this fiscal crisis in the state. We don't care about PFAS. But meanwhile, the issue kept festering and fermenting. So we also asked for liability protection. Let me talk to you a little bit about that. If you work in dry cleaner program or in petroleum, they have liability protection from third-party lawsuits. And we tried to put liability protection from some cities. No, that didn't go anywhere. So the legislature, one of the departure points was, we're not going to give liability protection to anybody in this state. So we went back to the drawing board. So with that in mind, we realized whoever is going to be a responsible party is in charge of remediating this thing, and they can be subject to lawsuits. Okay. Moved to last year, 2021, the legislature heard us, and heard us again. But they were worried about budget, yet again. As you know, in the state of Florida, the legislature has only one job to do, and that's to have a balanced budget. That's all it has to do. And the rest is just gravy, all the bills that come down that address health and environment and everything else. But we began this process to meet with some interested legislatures that had a background in environmental science, and they saw that, this is a big issue. So we began to track the federal work, and where this is going. We began to track other states, Colorado, Michigan, that have a lot less or more restrictive PFAS and PFOA concentrations. And so we began to form this group. It's an ad hoc group, airports, cities, a disparate group of people that would have never talked to each other, but ultimately they are responsible for paying us to assess and eventually remediate, which is arguably one of the most expensive and issues in our lifetimes, this PFAS. I mean, forget about dry cleaner fluids, those old recalcitrants. This is serious stuff in the state of Florida, and it's everywhere. I mean, we have it in our bloodstream. So let's move to 2022, and I'm here to tell you what happened. And I know I have my good friend Kina right there. She works with the landfill industry, and I think I see a few attorneys that probably I communicated with. And in 2022, we had two competing laws in the state of Florida. One of them said, we're going to form a task. Okay, we're going to chew this elephant one bite at a time. And one of the Senate and House bills said, we're going to form this task force. And this task force has to give recommendations on how we're going to address this thing by next summer, 2023. We felt maybe it was too fast in order to have a solution to a problem of such magnitude. The other rule said, look, let's tell DEP to tap the brakes a little bit in this. Let's tell DEP we need to come together with DEP and a bunch of people to figure out how Florida, we really don't care how Michigan does this, how Colorado does it, California does it. This is our state. We've got to figure out how we're going to address this with Florida resources, Florida money, Florida stakeholders. And so, how do we wrap our arms around this big elephant, knowing that there's a Niagara of regulations coming down? So, the bill and we began to talk to the legislatures. And by the way, my client was the city of Pensacola, who is 50,000 people. Escambia County is huge, but Pensacola is 50,000 people, and they had already spent upwards of 6 figures trying to assess these substances. And these substances were everywhere. And so, where do we go? How did we get where we are? And I'll tell you a little bit where we are and how we're going to get forward. So in essence, the task force didn't make it. It was probably too unwieldy, too many associations trying to get in, firefighters, airports, seaports, landfills, and eventually the legislature said, it's just too much and too short. Let's ask DEP to tap the brakes. Let's figure out what we're going to do and tell DEP another thing. By 2025, you got to have a promulgated rule that is ratified by the legislature. Why ratified by the legislature? Because there is an economic component to addressing PFAS in Florida. It costs money. And so the legislature said, tap the brakes. We're going to get ourselves a promulgated rule that's going to be accepted by the legislature by 2025 or before. Okay? So, in essence, what we accomplished this year is the following. There is a reprieve for some responsible parties. Not everybody. The legislation does not give any reprieve to the private sector. So the private sector, if you have clients on the private sector, the legislation doesn't give them any type of waiver of protection. It just gives a waiver of protection to cities and utilities because cities are directly responsible for for providing you with firefighting services. It also, the cities give you the potable water we drink or treat the wastewaters we discard. And as it's been said, wastewaters do have PFAS, and there's going to be effluent limits. So in other words, regulations are going to be everywhere. But, we need to figure out who's on first base, who's on second, who's on third base. So, in that, the legislation gives limited immunity to cities and utilities. It doesn't give any immunity to the private sector. But what's the fundamental point, the message I'm going to give you today on this is what the legislature is trying to figure out more than anything is a funding solution. Those of you that work on petroleum or on dry cleaner, there's a dedicated source of money for that through the taxpayer. If you work on DoD work through your company, we all are paying the installation restoration program. I worked in that program for many, many years. So the taxpayer eventually ends up funding these cleanup programs. Well, we don't have one right now in the state of Florida. We really don't. The money has to come out from you, the taxpayer, through your property taxes if you are working for whatever city or the fire department. But that can only go so far because, again, this is going to be an expensive undertaking. And so what the legislature, and I spoke with the sponsors in the Senate and the House, is we want to tap the brakes while we look for a funding solution to this thing. The legislature, based on my talks with the state representatives and state senators, they fully recognize that once this becomes a hazardous substance under CERCLA, there will be responsible parties. some sites are going to go back. They're going to be Superfund sites. There's no question about it. And the legislature recognized that. But, meanwhile, because to become a Superfund site, it takes a while. It has to go to circulates. It's got to be approved by Region 4. The regional administrator has to sign. And, the state has a 10% share cost of that program. So we all end up paying for that anyway. So what the legislature has accomplished this session in 2022, and by the way, the bill is not law yet because it hasn't been signed by the governor, is we want to bring a ad hoc coalition of groups, airports who truly could be responsible parties in this, even though they were mandated by the FAA to use firefighting foam, seaports, landfills. Dry cleaners in Florida are mom and pop businesses. And so they don't know what's coming down their pike if one of them becomes a Superfund site under the EPA designation that's in the White House. So what the legislature is trying to do is try to accomplish this task force in a backwater way. Let's meet once this becomes law. Let's try to bring some groups to advise where do we go from here, and more importantly, how do we begin to fund what arguably is one of the most expensive issues we have in Florida? Because we drink groundwater that may be impacted with PFAS. So that's the message right now. And I don't have a long presentation or a wind-up. How do we begin to think? As you know, in Florida, there are two sources of funding. Some legislatures are thinking about combining the IPTF, the fund that cleans gas stations. That program, it's beginning its eventual landing if you work in that program. Dry cleaner is a small funding source, but certainly those two are joined at the hips, PFAS and dry cleaner fluids. And so that's one of the ideas. How do we fund this cleanup and assessment without impinging on the cities or you or me, the taxpayer, to fund this? Eventually, it's going to have probably be through that combination or another tax. And as you know, in Florida, the Republican legislature does not like to tax. That's one of their mantras. We're not going to tax anybody. We're open for business. And so, but that's what is the message. How do we begin to fund this? Where are the sources of funding going to come from? And to do that, the folks that make the laws, so we react to the laws, are looking for advice from experts. Certainly cities will be involved in this. If you work for cities, if you work for the private sector, that's where the things are going to come down. More importantly, because we also found out that the EPA had sent their rule to the White House. And the EPA today, has never declared a hazardous substance under CERCLA. But PFAS will be there. And so, granted, the White House is caught in Ukraine and everything that's going on out there in the dysfunctional DC. But, it's still, the rule is going to come down whether it's in 90 days and in 120 days. Some that really caught our attention when we were tracking this thing is, and it's a statement of need. The EPA said that this rule is not economically significant. And we're like, interesting, because we all believe that the rule is economically significant. It's going to affect everybody, liability, reopener clauses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we looked at that, and that's why we put 2025. We recommended to the legislature they put 2025 as the time for adopt, perhaps, the EPA standard, which may be less than 70 parts per trillion. And by the way, that was one of the issues. The provisional non-promulgated standard in Florida is 70 parts per trillion. What if the federal government has 50? What happens with those parties that have done it? Are they obligated under CERCLA to keep assessing? And the answer is yes. So again, I think the message is there is a temporary reprieve in terms of where are we going to go in Florida on this. But it's not going to be just a regulatory obligation mandated approach to this. I think the approach is going to be, we all need to come together, the responsible parties, the landfill industry, et cetera, and figure out how do we chew this elephant. So I would, in conclusion, I would recommend you to be proactive in your professional associations. The Florida Association of Professional Engineers is part of this group. The Association of Geologists, I think it should be. If you work for a chemical industry, they'll be there. So we're trying to figure out, again, where do we go from here? We have until 2025, or I think before, when DEP is going to have the promulgated standard to prepare ourselves for what's going to be, one of the biggest issues in our market in a long time. I mean, most of us could not spell PFAS 4 or 5 years ago, and here we are, So, again, there's a temporary reprieve, but it's only temporary, as most things are in life. And where do we go? How do we fund this? Who's going to pay for this? It's going to be us eventually, but how? When are the key questions that the people that make the laws up in Tallahassee are looking for. Funding is the issue. Meanwhile, I think for those of you that have received those 62,780 letters, or your clients, there are some series of continuing obligations. I mean, some cities have opted to just put the stop on more assessment while we figure out what to do for a lot of reasons. Liability protection for themselves, even though there is immunity in Florida, but that's limited. Some firefighter departments are also saying, okay, let's put the brakes on this thing and try to figure out where we're going to go in Florida. So again, I don't have a whole lot more to add, except that, one more time, it's a temporary reprieve for a lot of folks, but we got to chew this elephant one chew at a time, under the old African saying, we gotta go small at it. It's trying to do everything in light of what's happening at the federal level. It's just way too much. There's effluent standards coming down. What's going to happen with water utilities, wastewater? How are they going to address these discharges into surface waters of the state that in many cases have the highest degree of protection? There's zero discharge. So again, the message is we do have a temporary reprieve. We're going to come together, those of us, cities, et cetera, try to figure out how to fund this thing. So stick around. You will retire on PFAS. Thanks.
Thank you for a financial perspective, Jorge. And next we have Teresa Booeshaghi, Assistant Director of the Division of Waste Management, Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And she's going to talk about the state of Florida perspective and a legislative update. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here in person this year. I have not had my coffee yet, though, so be kind. All righty. So I want to start out just by talking a little bit about the department's website, where you can find all the updates on everything that the state has been doing with respect to work on the PFAS issue. There's information out there on our technical resources, the areas of investigation that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes, fact sheets, FAQs, that kind of thing. But most importantly is our dynamic plan, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but it's basically akin to the state's version of the EPA's roadmap. So it kind of outlines the path that we're on as we move forward, what sorts of things that the state's going to be doing, where we plan to move in the future, that sort of thing. And it is a sort of a living document. You'll see that the most recent update was March 2022, so I encourage you to kind of check back periodically. I think our goal is to try to every 6 months or so, unless there's a significant change, to go in and update that document. So a little bit of history on how the state first became involved. Aaryn talked a little bit earlier about how the UCMR kind of kicked it off, and that's very true for Florida as well. So Florida ended up with 3 municipal well systems that were above the 70 part per trillion health advisory level. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes as well. But that's basically was the trigger point for all of the work that Florida has done to date. So we ended up developing provisional cleanup target levels. So under Chapter 376 and 403 Florida statutes, along with our cleanup Rule 62780, the department has the ability to derive cleanup target levels for ones that are not already present, and it gives default parameters in 62780.15 or 777 on how we can develop those. And you'll see that I also highlighted here for everyone's benefit the language that the department has been relying on in paragraph 7 there for those provisional cleanup target levels being enforceable. So we ended up with the groundwater target level of 70 parts per trillion. That's individually or combined for PFOA and PFOS. At this time, that's the only compounds that the state of Florida is looking at. We also have soil cleanup target levels, and those are 1.3 milligrams per kilogram for soils, but both PFOA and PFOS, 25 milligrams per kilogram in a commercial setting, industrial setting. And then leachability numbers of 0.002 and 0.007, so pretty low on the leachability side of things. Because we also have a large amount of surface water in Florida, we immediately got involved in a couple projects that involve surface waters and went ahead and developed, in conjunction with our Division of Environmental Assessment and Restoration, surface water screening levels for protection of human health consumption of fish and shellfish, and then also for protection of aquatic receptors. So these numbers are not promulgated, they're not enforceable, they are really just a sort of a screening tool for you to utilize if you have a surface water feature at your facility. Similarly, we worked on irrigation well screening levels, not enforceable, really just a kind of basic guideline on whether or not you may need to evaluate your site for additional risk due to irrigation well. These, as I've been told, we worked with DOH and UF on this, and our partners at DOH have said that these numbers are very, 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 very conservative. So. And speaking of DOH, we do work very closely with DOH on all of our PFAS investigations. In any instance where we collect a sample from a site and we find a monitoring well that has above 70 parts per trillion, we trigger a well survey with DOH, and they'll go out and do a 1-mile survey of any wells and do sampling. Based on the results that they get from their sampling event, we'll either provide water filtration or connection to a municipal system. That's through DEP's Water Supply Restoration Program. But DOH does go out, if it's between half the HAL and the HAL, they will go out and quarterly monitor those wells to make sure that they don't ultimately end up tripping that health advisory level. And then if the sample right now is less than 35 nanograms per liter, we're not doing any additional sampling of that particular well. All right, so I talked a little bit about UCMR3 and that kind of kicking off the state's investigations. So the 3 municipal systems that were impacted in Florida were Emerald Coast Utilities Authority, the City of Zephyr Hills, and the City of Stewart. So our site investigation section and housed in our waste cleanup program went out and did some cursory work to determine the source of PFAS at all of 3 of these particular facilities. And lo and behold, we believe that AFFF is the source of PFAS in all of these cases. The Emerald Coast Utilities Authority is co-located, it's on an airport property, and there's also a fire station on that airport. The City of Zephyr Hills was co-located with a fire station, and then the City of Stewart is sort of a large complex plume with multiple sources, including the city's fire training complex. The Martin County has a landfill facility there, and Martin County also has a public safety complex there as well. And important to note, all of these water systems are now in compliance. They have, they're not providing water that's above the health advisory level to the communities they're serving. So seeing that AFFF was a significant source of contamination across the state, we started to think, maybe we should take a look at these fire training facilities that are all across the state. And so we reached out to our partners at the Division of Financial Services, which houses the Fire Marshal's office, and we got a list of the 45 fire training facilities that they have as certified right now on their records. And we did sort of a cursory review of those facilities, and we asked them about whether or not they had used AFFF and whether or not, what areas, what stormwater features did they have, public or private drinking water supply. So based on that information, 19 of those facilities confirmed that they had used AFFF on their property, and 7 of them were not sure. 19 of them reported that they hadn't used it at all. So we went out and we started doing some, in September of 2018, we started with the Florida State Fire College based on the ranking. We had basically taken those surveys and ranked them based on what we thought was the most significant risk. The Fire College in Ocala being the top of our list due to their usage of AFFF, and they actually have an on-site drinking water well that they use, and the students are housed there for some period of time on campus throughout the year, that kind of thing. So we went out in September 2018, and lo and behold, we found significant levels of PFAS in the drinking water well that was being used on the property, as well as in soils and groundwater across the property. So that sort of told us, we've got an issue here and we need to go and look a little further. So we ended up taking those other facilities. We ended up with 26 total. It broke them into 2 different phases. So the first phase of that investigation, we would go out to the site. We'd talk to the fire chief and the staff on the property, kind of find out what areas they used the foam and a little bit about what was in the nearby community, were there schools nearby, were there private wells nearby, that kind of thing. And then we would go out and we would come back to the office, and then we would work on a scope of work and go out and implement phase 2, which was the sampling part of things. And we did pretty much a very rudimentary assessment at each one of these sites to begin with. 2 to 3 direct push groundwater samples in most cases, and a handful of soil samples. So what we ended up with was 26 of the former fire training facilities, and as a result of our investigations on those, we found another 2 that were former facilities that have been impacted. And overall, 25 of the 28 sites that we looked at had groundwater contamination above the provisional cleanup target level of 70 parts per trillion. We had a number of these sites as well that also have off-site private well contamination, where we had DOH go out and do those well surveys. And so 8 of these fire training facilities are actually state-owned fire training facilities. So DEP received an appropriation from the legislature to continue assessment and remediation on those sites. And then the other sites were primarily municipally owned, and that goes back to what Jorge was saying, where the department issued 780 letters of potential responsibility to those municipalities, local governments, saying, hey, you might have an issue here, and you might have responsibility under 780 to perform cleanup. So they're all kind of in various stages, but again, our website does have up-to-date information on those, so go out and check that out if you're curious about those individual sites. And as we started to, as we continued to learn more and more about PFAS, and we, attended webinars just like everybody else, and partnered with our other states, and we got with a lot of the states in the Northeast who were much further advanced than the state of Florida. 1 or 2 of them had talked about PFAS contamination at their dry cleaning facilities, and so we thought, okay, well, maybe we should look at ours and see what we've got. So we did a pilot study on our dry cleaning solvent cleanup program sites. We initially started out with 15 sites and went out. Again, we did sort of a really rudimentary, we used the existing wells that were on those dry cleaning facilities from the work that was going on under the dry cleaning program, and tried to focus in on 2 or 3 of the wells that were hot spots basically under the VOC component of the program. And 10 of those ended up coming back with PFAS above the 70 parts per trillion. So we thought, hey, we should expand this, and so we ended up including another 30 sites in our pilot program. And 22 of those came back. Now, we're not seeing the same concentrations that we're seeing associated with the fire training facilities. They tend to be, more localized plumes and smaller, lower concentrations, that kind of thing. But that led us to do a white paper to try to figure out, well, what is the source of this PFAS at these dry cleaning facilities? Is it coming from the waste stream? Is it coming from the solvents that are actually being used? What's the issue? So we had a contractor work with us. They went out and took some samples of both the raw solvents and the waste stream. And as you can see, I'm not going to go through all these and read all these, but as you can see, basically the solvent samples themselves really didn't show any evidence of PFOS or PFOA. So we really think this is a byproduct of the actual dry cleaning process and the solvents releasing the PFAS from the clothing during the dry cleaning. So here is a slide from, this is one of the slides that was in, or one of the pictures that was in the actual white paper. And you can see, so the red plume, or the red outline is the PFAS plume, and the yellow outline is the VOC plume. And we tried to make some sort of correlation between the VOCs and PFAS. Is there any, dynamic here? But we really weren't able to come up with very much. The plumes, although sometimes they tended to kind of head in the same direction as you might expect, there really was not any observed correlation between the two. The PFAS were typically shallower. Our dry cleaning solvents were, deeper, as you would expect. I would say one thing that we did learn from these radial diagrams is that we do think, as many of these dry cleaning facilities are located in industrial areas, and so we are able to kind of pull that out to see that there are likely multiple sources of PFAS contamination in some of these areas. So, but bottom line, we really think that the PFAS itself is not from the solvents being used, but from the release of the clothing, et cetera, during the process. So, and similar to our dry cleaning pilot, we decided to take a look at our state lead cleanup sites. So these are what you hear referred to as our indigent or orphan sites, where the state has taken on responsibility for the cleanup because there's no responsible party, either they've gone bankrupt or whatever. So we looked at 29 of these sites, and we focused in on this sector, right? What type of facility were these, and whether or not they were, suspected to have PFAS contamination based on what we knew nationally of what people were finding. So we focused in on landfills and chrome platers and sources where we would expect to find PFAS contamination. And we ended up finding 14 of those facilities having contamination above the provisional cleanup target level. Again, not the same concentrations like we're seeing associated with the AFFF, but still above the provisional cleanup target levels. And then we continue to work with our partners at federal facilities across the state. I'm sure you guys have heard nationally that DOD has had a significant issue with PFAS contamination. It's no different in Florida. They do have some significant concentrations in the millions in some cases. And a lot of that information is publicly available, so you can, if you're interested. They do also have some on-base and off-base drinking water supply issues that they're addressing. So we're trying to work with them and keep their projects moving forward. All three branches in the military seem to be doing things slightly differently, so that's a little bit of a complicating factor. But they have been really good about hosting public meetings and that kind of thing in the areas where they're conducting the community-wide sampling, that kind of thing. We have also seen sort of a recent uptick in other sites. Jorge kind of alluded earlier to some of the, we have seen a few sites kind of go into it voluntarily under the Brownfield program. But we are seeing more private responsible party sites kind of pop up. One of them, the Port of Tampa CSX site, actually we discovered through assessing of one of the state cleanup sites, that Musselman Steel site in Tampa. And as we were doing our sampling out there, we noticed that the samples we were collecting didn't seem to comport with our conceptual site model. So we went back, did a little bit of homework, and found out that there had been a tanker derailment in the past, and an ethanol tanker had overturned, and the local fire department responded with phone to put that fire out. So we were able to use the historical aerial photos and news footage and that kind of thing to kind of piece together what had happened there. And the Southwest District Office now is currently working with both the Port of Tampa and CSX on that particular assessment. And then under our CERCLA program, this is a New Beginnings custom chrome facility. It's in the Northeast District Office. They sent it to us that the property owner had gone bankrupt, and it was just sort of sitting there. And anyway, we went out and evaluated it for CERCLA site screening, which is the sort of the feeder into the Superfund program. And although it didn't make it through to the Superfund process, it did have contamination on site and in some nearby private wells. So Northeast District staff is working with the current property owner who just assumed the property not long ago to kind of bring that to a close. And that brings us back to our dynamic plan. So where the department goes from here. So we're going to continue to work on those areas of contamination that we know about, those facilities, fire training facilities, dry cleaning, state cleanup sites that we've been working on, kind of continue our assessment there. We've done some remedial actions out of the fire college. We have more remedial actions planned at some of the other state facilities. So that's our main focus right now. We have included on our dynamic plan the prioritization of the other potential sites that we're going to look at in the future. We've talked about solid waste facilities, wastewater treatment plants, fire stations, Superfund sites, or anywhere there may have been a discharge of AFFF due to emergency response. But as of right now, those actions are sort of on hold, but it is something that the department knows that these are all likely significant sources of PFAS contamination, so at some point in the future will probably be captured. But with that, there's also so much uncertainty. Jorge alluded to House Bill 1475, which basically put the department on notice that if EPA hasn't adopted groundwater target levels by 2025, and the agency has to go through the formal rulemaking process and have those promulgated and go through the legislature for ratification. There's a few, that bill has not been signed yet, but there's a few kind of things that the agency is sort of working through with relation to that and how it would end up working, especially it includes soil. EPA, won't be looking at soil. So we'll likely, even if EPA does promulgate an MCL that we would likely just adopt, we'll still end up having to do some sort of rulemaking to address the soil cleanup target levels, that kind of thing. And we don't know how comprehensive, whether or not we're just going to be looking at PFOA, PFOS, or whether or not we'll be looking at other PFAS compounds as well. We expect that the UCMR sampling results might trigger another round of source investigation. They're casting a little bit wider net, looking at a lot more facilities than they were this last time around, looking at more compounds. So we do think that that very well could, trigger some more investigations. And then again, the federal actions, what EPA does, how they designate substances, whether or not they lower the health advisory level, all of that is going to have a significant interplay into where the department goes next. And then, of course, the emerging science. And as we all know, not only is the toxicity information, changing rapidly as we learn more and more, but also the technologies, right, as far as assessment and remediation go, and for treatment and disposal ultimately. So, we're kind of we're monitoring all of this and trying to figure out where we go next. But all of these things may have a significant impact on where the agency goes from here. So stay tuned. That's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Teresa. We have our final speaker this morning, and we might need just a few extra minutes because we had 5 speakers instead of 4. John Gardella, shareholder and founding member of CMBG3 Law, and he will speak on PFAS, water regulatory updates, future predictions, and impacts on corporate needs. So, welcome, John.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Martha. And thank you to Jean and everybody on the host committee for having me speak here. This is my first time here, so I'm very excited to be here. As Martha said, I'm a lawyer. But before I get strung up putting the cart and you throw rotten vegetables at me, let me just propose to you that we're actually sort of on the same page and on the same team with respect to PFAS. And I say that because I don't represent anyone in the actual PFAS manufacturing industries. I represent companies, whether it's small mom and pop dry cleaners, all the way up to Fortune 100 companies that are addressing these PFAS issues. And I'll always work, as Jorge alluded to, actually hand in hand with professionals, engineers, site assessors like yourselves on these very issues. So my angle today is certainly not technical. It is more of an introspective look at what corporations today are interested in and what they're looking to in the future from us, really, as to what the risks are. And the unfortunate part about going last is I'm going to try and not repeat things that were said, although that's going to be very difficult to do. Fortunately, I was pretty good at predicting that the roadmap would be covered, so we're skipping that. But I think we'll jump right in. All right. With drinking water, and I'm not going to cover a lot of this because it's been covered quite in depth, but there were a few things that I did want to mention. One is, Aaryn, if the EPA is looking for an extended spring deadline for the drinking water, come to New England, come to Boston, because it'll be July before it feels like anything like it does down here, which is beautiful. First thing I did want to mention, though, with respect to drinking water, I would just say, and just add to everything that's been said here today, is pay very close attention and have your clients pay very close attention to what's going on with the Science Advisory Board. And I say that for one real reason, and that is really reflected in what came out just a couple weeks ago in the draft report by the SAB. And that is there were undertones or notes or hints of uncertainty in some of the comments that were made. Not uncertainty as to whether PFAS should be regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. In fact, it seemed like they were agreeing with the EPA's recommendation for PFOA to be likely carcinogen, PFOS to be a possible carcinogen, and even maybe a likely carcinogen. But what I saw in that was future legal challenge. And the reason I say that is because they were addressing specifically the methodology that the EPA was taking in making the recommendations for the drinking water standards. They were suggesting that maybe the EPA share more information about how it reached its conclusions and be more forthright in the future as it moves forward in terms of sharing more information and how the methodology took place in terms of how it's reaching its conclusions. To me, as a lawyer, those types of terms, those types of statements are, exhibits A through Z or however many there were in future challenges, legal challenges to whatever regulations the EPA puts forth. So I did just want to flag that. I actually think that there are hearings tomorrow and Friday of this week, if I got that correct, by the SAB on this very issue. So it's virtual, it's free. You just have to sign up, and it may be worth listening to. I plan to as well. Now, Taryn already did a beautiful job of covering this, so I'm not going to go over this map in any detail or the next slide that I have. I'll breeze through these, but I do want to mention one thing. My experience with a lot of corporations when they are asking me or any of you about how to come into compliance or how to best protect themselves from risk in states that may not yet have drinking water standards, is that they may not be fully on board with the concept of changing industrial or commercial practices in more than just one state. And I'll use New York and New Jersey as an example, both which actually do have drinking water standards. First of all, there are many companies that have footprints in both New York and New Jersey from a business perspective. And since they have those footprints in both states, they have footprints from PFAS perspective in both states as well, right? If they have a PFAS issue. The problem is New York and New Jersey have differing standards for drinking water. This poses a problem for a lot of corporations that have that sort of dual risk factor. Because if you come into compliance in New York, for example, you still may not be in compliance in New Jersey. So what does the corporation, what are they faced with doing? Do they come into compliance in different ways in each state? Do they come into compliance using the most strict standard and adopting it universally? There are cost considerations to this, of course, and as you know, that's one of the biggest hurdles in effectuating change among corporations, is getting them to understand not only the risk, but getting them on board with adopting cost proposals. And I recognized a lot of the names of the sponsors here today and in the hallway. Some I did not, but I don't know everyone's varying degree with potentially hiring forensic economists as part of what you do. It could be valuable and it could be key, and we've actually experienced that and done that to help companies understand, actually put dollar valuation risks on the various proposals that are being made by professionals such as yourselves. Even if they're not publicly traded, all corporations care about balance sheets. They have to. And so bringing in an added service like that has been extremely influential and beneficial to a lot of the companies that I've had the opportunity to represent. So just wanted to throw that out there as a suggestion. I'm going to skip this slide. I think it's been covered. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of variety among the states and what they're doing with respect to drinking water standards. Second big topic I did want to briefly cover, because it is of imminent concern for a lot of industries out there in the United States, is consumer goods. So right now, the biggest one that's receiving all the attention, right, is actually food packaging. Now, I think it was Taryn that actually updated this slide for me. I have 14 states that have proposed or actually passed regulations. As you can see, or you may have seen from a prior slide, this presentation was made several weeks ago. I think it's up to 17. Yeah, so we got to add 3 to this slide right here. So this one's a little bit out of date. However, I mentioned this one because the food industry, the food packaging industry, is especially concerned about all of the PFAS topics that we've talked about today, basically from sort of a cradle to grave from their perspective. They're concerned about the water that they're bringing into their facilities in the manufacturing process. Does that have PFAS contamination? Because almost all of them have an effluent component to that. They have wastewater discharge issues. They're putting a product into the stream of commerce that contained historically, or does contain still in some instances, PFAS. And they're concerned about their waste if they're using landfills. There is going to be sort of waste naturally from whatever manufacturing process they do, and a lot of them are using landfill resources to dispose of that waste, which is perfectly fine, and they have permits to do it, and it's legal. The problem is, the CERCLA issue. Those same companies are extremely concerned about future liability risk. And later on today, in a couple minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about CERCLA, but it's companies or industries like these, not just the waste management companies themselves, that are concerned about the CERCLA liability issues. So talking to these companies now about all of these issues is incredibly important. The biggest hurdle with companies, as you can imagine, is, gosh, do we invest now to prevent a problem in the future that's going to be a huge hit? We didn't plan for this. But you have to pitch to them, if you wait, the bottom line, the financial risk, the financial hit is going to be 10-fold, 50-fold, 100-fold potentially to your financial balance sheets. And again, bringing in appropriate professionals who can actually do the economics on that is very key to helping them understand those risks. Aside from food packaging, lots of consumer goods, as a number of them were mentioned today, but there are certainly some other industries that are especially concerned on the cradle to grave sort of factors that I just mentioned from the food packaging. I listed some of them here. I mentioned just a few of the most recent updates and kind of products that are receiving a lot of attention. The only one I want to highlight in my comments here are the cosmetics industry. There have already been 6 lawsuits in the past 5 months targeting the cosmetics industry specifically with respect to PFAS. Now, these lawsuits address what's commonly called greenwashing. You know, you're advertising this product as safe. You're advertising this product as environmentally friendly or green, yet it contained PFAS, therefore what you said is false. These are consumer fraud kind of claims. 6 lawsuits in the past 5 months against an industry that's a multi-billion-dollar industry is huge. And this is only sort of the tip of the iceberg from my perspective, and I think from a lot of people's perspectives. But I use it as an example to sort of show that while these sort of greenwashing claims are, relatively speaking, legally speaking, easy claims to prevail on, the industries are extremely concerned about what comes next for them. And it's everything that we've talked about today on this panel. It's going to be talked about, you know, today and tomorrow. All the circle claims, the drinking water effluent claims, the landfilling claims, all of these things. And in the future, personal injury claims as well. That's something that everybody is extremely concerned about, corporate-wise. So, looking a little bit ahead, I should have put the bottom bullet point probably at the top here, because my theme here, my thrust here is that, you know, we've talked a lot about the regulatory changes, and I'm only speaking at the federal level, let me make that clear, that are coming. But what I see as an attorney, not only for the reasons I mentioned with respect to the SAB, is legal challenges to those same regulations that are coming at the federal level. And there are reasons for this, some of which I tried to bullet here. You know, the roadmap, of course, has very clear delineated timelines, which is wonderful. It's the first time that, you know, really we ever received that with respect to PFAS, and it's great. Some of the issues that industry are concerned about, and industry groups really are concerned about this and are willing to take the action, and I do not represent them either, but two of them that I'll highlight is, well, what are PFAS? If you're going to regulate, you know, beyond just PFOA and PFAS, fine. But if you're going to talk about regulating PFAS as a class or categories or subsets, what does that mean? Because if you go on the EPA website, 6 months ago, they were making this up, but there were 9,000 PFAS listed. If you go on just 2 weeks ago, there are 12,000 listed. So the industries are likely to push back on, well, what is it exactly that's being regulated, because it doesn't even seem like some of the regulatory professionals can quite figure out what the scope of what a PFAS chemical is. The second is, it was Aaryn who was mentioning sort of the categories or the buckets, the 70 buckets that sort of the EPA is considering regulating on. I would fully expect some industries to push back on that and say, and attack not only the methodology, but the scientific thinking or scientific reasoning behind whether or not all the PFAS that were put in the specific buckets are in fact similar enough such that they could have been regulated as one single class. So I point this out because, you know, obviously the EPA is working extremely hard. Many of the states are working extremely hard in pushing forth these regulations. I think what the industry is going to push back with is saying, that's wonderful. However, you perhaps put, you know, sort of public pressure over scientific process. And whether that's valid or not, it's of course not my decision. It's a court's decision. But I do just want to flag it because it's part of why I was called here to talk today. Now, specifically with respect to Safe Drinking Water Act and all the drinking water standards, sort of future things to look forward to. We've talked about some of them. I think just beyond PFOA and PFAS, we're certainly going to see more in the years to come. PFAS added to drinking water standards. Gen X is kind of a natural one that a lot of people have talked about that may be next. But what I wanted to kind of flag, nothing new to any of you, I'm sure, is just the number of, or the significant impact that this has all had, even so far at the state levels. in states that have drinking water standards. You see a statistic here that we received in the Northeast region from the EPA up there. In 2021 alone, there were 1,000 pending state-level enforcement actions against companies that were not PFAS manufacturers for remediation costs, remediation cleanups. That's pretty significant, and in just about 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about 2 examples out of the Northeast just to show how significant the downstream impacts have really been on industries that you may not even think would have to worry about these issues, but they do. CERCLA, obviously been covered quite a bit. The only thing I do want to mention here is waste management industry, obviously the #1 prime target when you talk about CERCLA concerned, well, maybe not the #1, but it's right up there for concerned industry with respect to what's going to happen from CERCLA. But I have had conversations with clients as well, and I encourage you to as well to discuss with any size company where their waste is going. And if it's going into a landfill, you need to understand the full risk picture that entails for that client of yours. If any of you are more involved or familiar with the CERCLA lawsuits themselves, the lawsuits may only target 1 or anywhere up to 10 or even 50 companies who are allegedly responsible parties. But it's kind of what happens after the CERCLA action where a lot of the litigation kicks in and a lot of the what I call downstream companies are impacted financially because there are third-party lawsuits. The ones that were made to pay in the CERCLA action look to other parties that may not have been brought in to contribute to those costs. And that's where a lot of your clients are going to potentially come into play as well. Understanding the impact that the environmental justice movement is going to have on PFAS is also something that I think was talked about last night. I was not here. I flew in very late. I understand there was a presentation on this, and I'm sorry I missed it. The only thing I want to say is, the environmental justice or the EJ screen tool that the EPA has is an incredibly valuable tool to everything that we do for our clients and our companies with respect to PFAS, as well as other things. Why? Because it's a publicly available, easy to navigate tool that the EPA has created to show specific areas or regions that they are targeting for environmental justice issues. And when the PFAS regulations come, the EJ screen is naturally going to be one tool that shows the EPA exactly where to go or where to target some of its efforts with respect to PFAS action. And the other thing I wanted to mention here, I forgot what I was going to say, but was the middle point here. We've already seen some lawsuits settling where there's money set aside for these so-called environmental justice grants, basically money that will go to helping disadvantaged or otherwise underrepresented communities address PFAS issues. Now, this has only been in regions so far that are, the big sort of 3M DuPont areas of historic concern. But, with everything that happens with DuPont and 3M in the legal circle, it seems to trickle down. Expect to see much more of this in settlements, money being requested or set aside in settlements for environmental justice PFAS issues. And I raise this, it's a legal issue, but you need to be aware of it because it's a risk factor that you should definitely talk to your clients about as well and use that EJ screen tool that I mentioned. Last few slides here. Impacts on companies and our clients. Enforcement actions are obviously significantly up, as I just mentioned. As well as enforcement actions, though, the request for information, that's what they're called at the federal level, and in some states they're essentially what they sound like, requests for written information from companies about PFAS, have increased significantly as well. The important thing to ask your clients, if they tell you that these things have been sent to them, is that they must tell you. Because these written answers are almost like discovery in a lawsuit. They don't just go into a void and they never show up again, and somebody thinks, oh, well, thanks for checking my box, I'm going to put this in the shredder. No, this is future evidence for your clients, for these companies that are out there, if they are brought into these enforcement or regulatory actions. So having folks like you or attorneys like me help them answer those RFIs is critical. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because the time is dwindling on me here. So I wanted to conclude just by, as I mentioned, I've said a couple times today that a lot of the actions taken thus far have impacted companies that are extremely far downstream. You guys all probably represent companies like this as well, advise companies like this as well, or maybe if you're in a PFAS group, certainly other people in your companies represent these types of companies for other reasons. So corporate communication is really key to understand how you can even market or upsell this type of services to your clients. This is a case out of Massachusetts. We represented this client. It was a tire recycling facility. Sounds exactly what the name says. They took in rubber tires, they chopped them up into little bits, left them in piles on their site, and when somebody wanted to buy the rubber bits, they sold them and shipped them off. That's literally all they did. They had one piece of machinery on site, which was a grinder, and that's it. So why were they subject to PFAS at all? In 2010, before anyone really cared about PFAS substantially, they had a small fire on their site. The fire was probably the size of the small round tables holding up those projecting screens in this room right here, very small. Nevertheless, the fire department had to come. It responded to the fire, put out the fire. Nobody thought anything of this. The local DEP, the local EPA agency responded, said, you're all good, don't worry about it. 10 years later, this same company gets a letter in the mail from the local EPA agency saying, you've contributed to the PFAS drinking water pollution problem in the area. You're going to have to pay to clean this up. Obviously, in 2010, I wasn't even practicing law for this particular company, but we were subsequently for other reasons. I get a call saying, basically WTF. Why am I receiving this letter? What is it talking about? What the EPA arm had done is actually go into the fire department records for the town and find all instances of fires that were put out for companies that had any sort of presence near or neighboring a water source that ultimately ran into the drinking water supply. So this little company, it was a very small company who had a very little fire on their site, is navigating their way through, now they have me obviously helping with the legal stuff. They have professionals such as yourself helping them navigate what they need to do. Is spent, 6 figures on this type of small fire that the EPA previously had said, no need to worry about this. So this goes to everything we've talked about today. It's a reopener issue. It's a very small one, relatively speaking, but it really shows the impact that those will have. I think this is my last slide, and I'll just mention another prime example that was also out of New England, plastic recycling facility. Again, they took in plastic drinking water bottles and ran them through the process, cleaned them, crushed them, and then they would sell them in these huge cubes to companies that wanted to purchase this and actually recycle it. They were also hit with an enforcement action letter as well, saying that they had contributed to drinking water pollution in the area. They couldn't figure out why. It turned out that there were probably 2 reasons. One is the water that they were using that was coming into the facility to clean the plastic bottles that they were then crushing and recycling. That water was used in the process and then sent out as effluent. The second is there was likely PFAS contamination in some of the plastic products themselves that were coming in. But this was a relatively small company. It did not have a national presence, did not even have a regional presence. It just had one facility, one location. It never even dreamed that it would have to worry about this type of thing. It was worried about other environmental issues for sure, but not this one. And so it just goes to show what I've been talking about today. When you have clients like this, who they may tell you, we have nothing to do with PFAS, we're not worried about this. you are kind of the first line of defense for them. Hopefully so am I, saying, no, actually, you may need to look a little deeper into this and explain to them what the financial impact could be. So out of the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're almost at 10 after 10 for coffee time. Does anyone have a burning question that they want to ask before, while we still have everyone together? Or we can talk in the coffee room. We know Teresa needs her coffee yet. So I'd like to just thank all the speakers one more time. Let's give them a big hand. That was a lot of information. And you're set for coffee.
Recording stopped.